Hello and welcome to Teddy Tuts, brought to you by London Cyber School. Before we start, please note that this material is the copyright of London Cyber School Limited and all our rights are reserved. We are going to deal with the case study in this session. Now, many students, of course, will ask why the case study in the first place. Well, it helps us represent the real world in the classroom. And so we see more and more case studies forming part of the curriculum across many programs and many industries and disciplines. It enables students to address complex problems in a simulated environment, and of course, it enables the examiner to examine those complex solutions more effectively. So how best do we go about addressing the case study? Well, one obvious way is we read the case, and then we read the questions. Practice has demonstrated that there is a more effective, systematic way of dealing with the case study that brings about a more efficient conclusion with better results. We would refer to that as the RAID technique. So don't read the case, RAID the case. The RAID technique comprises a number of steps, the first of which is to read the questions related to the case first. Not the case, but the questions related to the case. And we read that twice. This helps us to read the case with knowledge of what we're looking for. So when we get around to reading the case, it's more like raiding the case for the data and information that we need to answer the question. By reading the question twice, it helps us check that we clearly understand what is required before we get into the detail of unpacking the case. This saves a lot of time because we're now approaching the case with a detailed knowledge of clear objectives that we need to achieve, and we're not just reading aimlessly. The next step is to analyze the question. Firstly, we need to establish what we are required to do. We look for the verb or objectives of the question. Next, we need to determine what we need to address, or, stated otherwise, we need to find the subject of the question. And before we move on, often we need to look for that specific aspect of the subject that we're required to deal with. In other words, we need to identify the focus that is required in answering the question. Please don't forget to identify the number of parts of the question. Far too often students get involved in answering the question and forget to complete the remaining components required. This has a devastating effect on the results. The next step is to identify theories, tools, and techniques that will enable us to answer the question effectively. Most questions have a theoretical foundation, and what is required is to identify the theory or theories that underpin the solution to the case study. The next step is to identify tools that will help us to answer the question more effectively. So, for example, frameworks, acronyms, diagrams, tools that will enable us to put the answer together in a systematic way. Then, to use the techniques that enable us to solve the problem. We need to know that we need to use specific accounting techniques, mathematical techniques, statistics, or logic. All of these, if properly identified, will enable us to do a thorough job of answering the question or questions correctly. And then, before we move on to reading the case, we need to consider the format in which the examiner wants the question to be answered. It could be an essay or a report. It may be a personal or business letter. It may be a group or individual presentation, demonstration, or even a recording. So before we start addressing the case itself, it's vitally important to know the format that is required for us to present the answer in. We've now read the question, and we've read it twice. We then analyze the question into its component parts, identify the theories, tools, and techniques that will enable us to deal with the case. We are now ready to unpack the case. In the process of unpacking the case, we can deploy a number of additional techniques that will enable us to do a more effective job. The first of these is the top and tail. We read the introduction and the conclusion, and that gives us a very broad overview of the case. The next step is to get a little closer by reading the headings and the first sentence of each paragraph. And while doing that, we look at the diagrams, graphs, and figures. We all know that a picture paints 1,000 words. And then at this point, we pause. We reflect and we read the question or questions again to refresh our memory and to prepare us for a detailed analysis of the case, taking notes of those data and facts that we need to solve the case question or questions. Remember, draft the answer in accordance with the requirements of the examiner, using those identified theories, tools, and techniques to enable you to achieve the objectives with respect to the focus of the subject. And that should give you a much better, much higher grade. I certainly hope that the RAID technique will be of assistance to you in the future. Thank you, goodbye, and remember to reflect.